Hello, I'm Laura Grace, and starting today, February 22nd, the National Democratic Institute's elections team will be joined by civic leaders from around the world for a virtual academy on monitoring political corruption and the abuse of state resources in elections. Really looking forward to the discussion this week. To kick us off today, we'll talk about a few different aspects of abuse of state resources in elections. We'll talk about how it impacts election integrity, how nonpartisan citizen groups can monitor abuses of state resources in elections, and how evidence of abuse can be used to advocate for change, whether that's stronger laws against corruption, more transparency in the election process, or other accountability measures. We'll also talk about how these approaches can be applied to other forms of corruption in elections and applied to processes beyond elections. To kick us off, we'll talk about definitions, principles, and framework about the abuse of state resources in elections. And throughout the presentation, you'll hear me refer to ASR as a shorthand for abuse of state resources. Importantly, it's important, we'll start at the root of ASR, which is really political corruption, which we view as any individuals, government officials, or their network benefiting from the powers of government for illegitimate private gain. And that can be financial powers or benefits or other forms of influence or value. We know that that can include bribery, extortion, nepotism, embezzlement, and other forms of corruption. And what we see more broadly happening in political corruption and other forms of government is similar to what we see in elections as well. So we define ASR as the misuse of government resources, whether that's material, human, coercive, regulatory, budgetary, media, or legislative, for electoral advantage. And it's important to note that ASR can happen in any different type of democracy, new or a new democracy or an old democracy, in democracies where a single party may be dominant at the national level or even at the regional level. But ASR also occurs in countries where power does change hands in elections. This is a critical thing to note because ASR is not always successful in impacting the outcome of the election. But regardless, we know that ASR, even in those instances, can damage elections and democracy more broadly and can detract from effective governance. ASR really has a direct impact on election integrity. It creates an uneven playing field, first and foremost, between incumbent candidates and opposition or challenging candidates or parties. Obviously, if incumbents have the all resources of the government to draw from, it would be nearly impossible for opposition parties to gain power. ASR can also limit the right of citizens to choose their representatives. They may not be able to learn freely about their different political choices if the incumbent government or candidates are at the forefront, have an unfair advantage. But ASR sometimes is also used to directly limit the ability of citizens to freely choose, even through intimidation or other matters, to freely choose their representatives. And of course, we know that ASR violates national election laws and constitutions, codes of conduct and transparency commitments, international obligations related to elections and corruption, and other democratic principles. But beyond elections, ASR also has some serious impacts on governance more generally. It takes public resources away from the general population for a select group of individuals or a certain group of citizens to benefit. It also takes resources away from the basic functions of government, like health or education, infrastructure or security, issues that really matter to everyday lives as citizens. And it also takes resources away from marginalized populations, women, communities of color, um, religious or ethnic minorities, or people impacted by conflict, populations that really may have a disproportionate need for government assistance and resources would otherwise not get that if corruption is pulling those resources for electoral gain. And finally, if left unchecked, ASR can lead to complete political domination, um, broader political corruption and state capture, and ultimately the failure of government to serve its citizens. Legal frameworks address ASR through a number of different areas: international obligations, including the ICCPR, other election frameworks, the Convention Against Corruption, all address various aspects of ASR. Regional bodies as well, including the African Union, the European Union, ECOWAS, the OAS, and SADC, also have regional commitments related to ASR, and whether that's clean elections or anti corruption commitments. Nearly every country will address ASR in some form or another, whether that's through their constitution or election laws, anti corruption laws, or other relevant legislation. Regulations, whether that's campaign finance or candidate registration, or even regulations outside of elections, maybe it's tax code or civil servant codes, can also provide a framework or accountability for ASR. And then finally, there are kind of informal commitments that may exist that can regulate ASR. That may be code of conduct, open government pledges, and other sort of mechanisms that create a framework for measuring and tracking and deterring ASR. So there are a number of different ways that ASR may appear in elections, and it really looks very different depending on the country. But we can break it down into a few different categories. Some abuses of resources may be institutional. So this may include physical infrastructure like buildings, vehicles, or other materials, or even human resources, whether that's the expertise or manpower of civil servants, or even the sort of stature that that high level government officials could bring to a campaign or a candidate. Regulatory resources may also be abused in elections, and that includes the unequal enforcement of laws, whether that's over prosecuting or targeting opposition or their supporters, or failing to prosecute or enforce laws for incumbents or their supporters. Coercive resources can also be abused in elections. That includes security forces or police or other government authorities that are used to intimidate opposition candidates or parties, voters themselves, or even civil servants to try to influence the election. Obviously, budgetary resources can be abused in elections. That can include kind of misdirecting public funds in an inappropriate way to try to win favor around election time. That can also include direct embezzlement of government funds for campaign purposes or other sort of tit for tat corrupt procurement issues that can happen in public expenditure. Media resources obviously can be abused for elections. That could include state run print or broadcast media. It can also include government websites or official social media accounts. All of these can be abused to either provide overly favorable coverage of incumbents or overly negative coverage of opposition figures. Legislative resources are also frequently abused. That can include passing laws that make it easier for incumbents to be elected or perhaps harder for opposition to gain power. Other areas can also of government resources may also be abused. So in some cases, that could be things like social media platforms that are sort of unregulated, or even things far outside of the standard election process, like emergency powers or other sort of resources. And when you're thinking about how these different abuses might occur or impact um, elections in your country and trying to decide which you would prioritize to monitor, it's really important to think about the impact that different abuses may have on the process that can help prioritize. So thinking about which abuses really have a very strong impact on candidates' ability to fairly compete for office or voters' ability to freely choose their representative, or thinking which abuses have a really significant impact on governance, whether that's because they're drawing large amounts of resources or large amount of government attention or function away from real governance needs to illegitimate electoral purposes. There are a number of different ways to monitor ASR, and groups can kind of think about these approaches when they're thinking about the types of abuse that they want to observe and thinking about their own resources in hand. So a few different approaches can include direct observation, so using either long or short-term observers to monitor abuses that may happen in kind of plain sight. So looking at campaign events or other aspects of the immediate election period to monitor different potential abuses. Another helpful approach is targeting certain stakeholders for detailed and systematic interviews, so that depending on the issue that you're hoping to monitor, that could include campaign officials, civil servants, election officials, community leaders, you know, even voters or members of marginalized populations that may be targeted with intimidation or vote buying attempts. It's also can be helpful to analyze and look at different sets of official data. So that could include information on official government expenditure or budget planning, development projects. That could include data on campaign finance reports, media kind of coverage, or other sort of data sets that may be at hand. Investigation is another helpful method of looking into ASR, and this can be a particularly effective method if the abuse is very, very sensitive or happens behind closed doors. Investigative journalists have a lot of successful approaches of using investigation to uncover corruption, and there are a lot of helpful lessons that election observers can learn on those approaches. You can also look at verified citizen reports or other forms of whistleblowing to capture more information on abuses and firsthand accounts of abuses. This can be particularly effective using tip lines from impacted individuals to submit evidence. And it can be really effective combining that approach with other methodologies that we're discussing here as well. Media monitoring and tracking of social media can be other helpful approaches to seeing or measuring how state media are either favoring or disfavoring certain candidates, and if any of those resources are being used unfairly. And of course, anytime you're thinking about different approaches to monitoring, it's helpful to think about what's feasible for your organization, given resources or timing, what structures or expertise you may already have that would fit well, and perhaps even different coalition partnerships that you could form to kind of take a varied approach. And of course, it's helpful to think through which monitoring method would be most impactful, what will have or bring forth kind of the most compelling data or evidence to shine light on the problem and influence change. And thinking about your kind of ultimate goals for monitoring ASR in elections, it's helpful to think through specifically what you hope to achieve through this project. So that could include perhaps strengthening the legal framework in your country, improving enforcement of existing laws, bringing forward new kind of mechanisms, whether they're promoting more ethics in elections or more transparency in the process. Some groups also aim to make institutions more independent, specifically thinking about the civil service and how perhaps through more transparency, training, better rules, better recruitment, those institutions can be stronger and less prone to political corruption and influence and abuse in elections. Of course, anytime we're talking about an advocacy strategy, it's also important to think about communications and how you can share the findings that you get from your approach. Some findings will likely be very compelling, and it's really important to really latch on and amplify those findings to the extent that you can. It's also really impactful to share data that is actionable for reformers. So that could be lawmakers, high-level bureaucrats, or others who are kind of inclined to act, but just need more information to know the exact scope of the problem, or perhaps to persuade others to join their cause for reform. It's always helpful to target your outreach to different audiences. They will all be motivated by different types of evidence. And so, really kind of intentionally thinking through what groups you're trying to reach, whether that's decision makers or other allies in the space or the general public, and pursuing those audiences in a very thoughtful way. And of course, it's always helpful to have really creative and dynamic communications assets to communicate that evidence and those findings and really tell the story of political corruption and elections. So that can include videos, um, infographics or animation, other things that really get a lot of traction on social media, or even things like op-eds or other kind of outreach that can draw a lot of attention and influence decision makers. And finally, of all the areas that we're talking about today, all of these approaches and principles and methodologies can extend even beyond ASR and elections. Of course, we know that there is, beyond sort of state-owned resources, there's a lot of corruption beyond the state that happens in elections. So that can include, in campaign finance, broader money and politics issues, with private media that may involve extreme bias or monopolization of media that should be monitored or addressed. And of course, we always need to think about interference from bad actors, whether those are foreign or domestic, particularly how that impacts the information space around elections, whether that's with disinformation and propaganda that can really damage confidence in elections or democracy more broadly. And then thinking beyond elections, all of these principles can be applied by election monitors or other civil society organizations to look at other governance structures. So service delivery and looking for corruption in those areas, whether that's health or education. A lot of the approaches we've discussed today could be applied there. Similarly, looking at other kind of policy or decision making, whether that's in any sort of branch of government or at the national or regional level. Any of these principles can be used to really make sure that those processes are inclusive, transparent, and accountable. Finally, we're really excited to continue this conversation this week with our Academy participants. Very soon, NDI will be releasing a guide on monitoring political corruption and abuse of state resources in elections and how civil society groups can monitor those abuses. You can learn more on ASR or on other areas on elections at www.ndi.org/elections. It's also always great to check out the global network of domestic election monitors at gendem.org, where you can find more resources and updates on the great work that election monitors are doing around the world and other resources. So we really look forward to continuing this conversation with you. If you have questions, please reach out. If you want to join the conversation, please reach out. We look forward to continuing this discussion with you. Thank you so much.